I want to start with some interesting statements by New Englanders. One who had been enslaved, Jedediah Morse, not Samuel Morse, a different Morse, they're related. Jedediah Morse, the great geographer, Yale grad, of course. Jedediah Morse got involved in all kinds of things, including a fascination with Midwestern Native Americans and their fates. But he was pretty well obsessed with how important and superior New England was. He said, in the North, people live in, quote, a happy state of mediocrity. They are a hardy race of free, independent Republicans, small r. And then he said, but in the South, this is in the very beginning of the 19th century, they live in what he called a disconsolate wilderness, a land of popular ignorance. These perceptions of Northerners of Southerners and Southerners of Northerners is something I'll return to next week. And then there's Noah Webster, the great Noah Webster of the dictionary fame, Yale grad. Noah Webster did many things, but especially that incredible dictionary. He said, among other things, quote, "O New England, how superior are thy inhabitants in morals, literature, civility, and industry." That captures almost everything. How superior. Now, of course, there were reasons these guys came to these views. They believed they were at the somehow, at least in New England, at the heart of the birth of American literature, the birth of American culture, the birth of American painting, and the arts, and so on and so forth. There will later be a book, a terrific book by a Southern literary historian who will argue. He's going to lay it mostly on Ralph Waldo Emerson and not on these Yale luminaries, but he had a few of them in there. He called it something like the other Civil War, and he made the argument that New England itself became, by the late antebellum period and certainly by the time of the Civil War, its own kind of lost cause. That it was trying to save something, preserve something, recreate something, hold on to something that it could no longer quite hold on to. No one more so than Timothy Dwight. I want to start us with a couple other passages. This is simply the opening little paragraph of one of the most widely read synthetic books on antebellum America, on the early republic up to 1848. Daniel Walker Howe, a terrific historian of so many years and so many books, opens his "What Hath God Wrought," a quote itself from Samuel Morse. He opens it this way. On the 24th of May, 1844, Professor Samuel F.B. Morse, seated amidst a hushed gathering of distinguished Dan's a good writer, of distinguished national leaders in the chambers of the United States Supreme Court in Washington, tapped out a message on a device of cogs and coiled wires. 40 miles away in Baltimore, Morse's associate, Alfred Vail, received the electric signals and sent the message back. The invention they had demonstrated was destined to change the world. For thousands of years, messages had been limited to the speed with which messengers could travel and the distance at which eyes could see signals such as flags or smoke. Neither Alexander the Great nor Benjamin Franklin, America's first postmaster general, 2,000 years later, knew anything faster than a galloping horse. You've all probably heard that metaphor before. What if you grew up in a time when the fastest thing on earth was a galloping horse? They're pretty fast, and they're beautiful, but they ain't the telegraph. Now, instant long-distance communication became a practical reality. The commercial application of Morse's invention followed quickly. American farmers and planters and most Americans then earned a living through agriculture, increasingly produced food and fiber for distant markets. Their markets and bankers welcomed the chance to get news of distant prices, distant credit, distant stocks. The New York Journal of Commerce, conceived by Morse himself and published by the famous Christian businessman and philanthropist Arthur and Lewis Tappan, who became abolitionist, Morse did not, could put such intelligence carried over the telegraph to good use. The journal has published continuously from 1827 to the present, and since 2000 on the internet. And of course, when the message came back, Morse is said to have said, "What hath God wrought?" Now, it's hard for us to imagine the telegraph. There's something so exciting. You might not even know it still exists. I found out it still exists. I was living in Britain about 10 years ago. I was up in Cambridge, but my nephew was in London at an art school, and he'd run out of money. Uncle Dave, he said, quote, "I am food insecure." I said, "Derek, does that mean you haven't got anything to eat?" "Yeah." "Can you wire me or telegraph me the money?" I said, "Is there still a telegraph?" I hadn't sent a telegraph since I could remember. I don't know when I did. Anyway, I got my bank to send it by telegram. He found a telegraph office. It was incredible. There still is a telegraph. Ain't that amazing? But just another thought here. I'm going to talk in a minute about this bewildering, growing, expanding, almost incomprehensible America of the first few decades of the 19th century. It is just booming and booming in population and growth, in expanse across the land, in diversity, religious and racial. And it's also beginning to develop the largest slave population on earth, becoming one of the most powerful slave societies on earth. One way to find out, Samuel Morse will be celebrated and celebrated and celebrated, and there are monuments to him. We'll come back to him in a minute. Possibly you could say Yale's second most famous graduate of the first half of the 19th century, next to John C. Calhoun. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And it was a no-brainer, by the way, when the powers at Yale sat down in 1933 to name their new residential colleges, which were just being built there in the center of campus, and some of you live in a Morse or a former Calhoun or others. It was a no-brainer to name a college for Samuel F.B. Morse, most famous invention of the 19th century. And a pretty damn good painter and a portraitist. And Calhoun, even more of a no-brainer. By far the most politically distinguished graduate of Yale. He became everything but president, and he tried that too, at least twice. But here was Frederick Douglass in his first narrative, the first autobiography of 1845, reflecting about his internal thoughts and feelings when imagining escaping from slavery on the Eastern Shore. This is toward the end of the first narrative. he's got this, he called them his band of brothers. They were always kind of scheming and trying to think up ways they could get away and so on and so on. But then he describes what their own imagination faced. And in a moment, I'm going to talk about early 19th century American imagination and the way it's exploding. But here was Douglas's imagination of what they faced. He and his little band of guys, 4 or 5 of them. The case sometimes stood thus, he said. At every gate through which we were to pass, we saw a watchman. At every ferry, a guard. On every bridge, a sentinel. And in every wood, a patrol. We were hemmed in upon every side. Here were the difficulties, real or imagined, the good to be sought and the evil to be shunned. On the one hand, there stood slavery, a stern reality, glaring frightfully upon us. Its robes, crimsoned with the blood of millions, and even now feasting itself greedily upon our flesh. On the other hand, away back in the dim distance, under the flickering light of the North Star, behind some craggy hill or snow-covered mountain, stood a doubtful freedom, half frozen, beckoning us to come and share its hospitality. This in itself was sometimes enough to stagger us. But when we permitted ourselves to survey the road, we were frequently appalled. Upon either side, we saw grim death, assuming the most horrid shapes. Now it was starvation, causing us to eat our own flesh. Now we were contending with the waves and were drowned. Now we were overtaken and torn to pieces by the fangs of the terrible bloodhounds. We were stung by scorpions, chased by wild beasts, bitten by snakes, and finally, after having nearly reached the desired spot, after swimming rivers and encountering wild beasts sleeping in the woods, suffering hunger and nakedness, we were overtaken by our pursuers, and in our resistance, were shot dead on the spot. But he still ran away. Douglas had that, some of you know this, that stunning and remarkable ability to capture in words what was, what is, about slavery and a whole lot of other questions. Now, the imagination of the early 19th century. Let's focus on Dwight for a moment and what he was trying to save, preserve, prevent, stop. Timothy Dwight became president in 1795 of this place, right after Ezra Stiles. They couldn't have been any different. I mean, they both came from slaveholding families. Morse from Fairfield County. His mother had sold 2 slaves. I'm sorry, not Morse, Dwight. His mother had sold 2 slaves to pay his way into Yale. He was Jonathan Edwards' grandson. These guys are all so related. It's amazing. He tried to make Yale, when he became president, a bastion of tradition, and he did, frankly. Tradition, authority, Calvinism, and federalism. This is a very political president of Yale. He was the kind of pillar, or if you like, staunchest defender of what Mike told you last time was called the Standing Order. Standing Order meant a theological worldview. It meant a hierarchical view of leadership. But this same Timothy Dwight was also a poet, a good one. He gave endless speeches and sermons. He's a trained minister since he went to Yale. He, frankly, hated Thomas Jefferson and all things French. He advanced all kinds of conspiracy theories, especially about the French Illuminati and the Jacobin meaning the far left radical threat to all things stable on planet Earth. He did not accept separation of church and state. There are parts of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that he hated. He said they were wrong. In fact, he thought a lot of the Declaration of Independence was nonsense. He believed in theocracy. He was a theocrat. He believed the United States should be run as a theocracy and run, likely, by Yale-trained ministers. Thank you very much. He was often called the Federalist Pope. Probably liked that. I mean, popery was as evil as the French, but Federalist Pope, probably thought that was kind of cool. He believed in a theocracy with an evangelical orthodoxy. He was a counter-revolutionary. He thought the American Revolution was, by and large, a mistake. It was a shame that the United States had lost this deep British influence. Now, he's still going to be president during the War of 1812 until 1815. It's going to be another war with Britain. He's not going to like that either. He owned 4 slaves, so far as we know, during his own life. He was, in almost extreme ways, anti-abolition. He believed the slave trade was a problem, like so many of our early leaders of Yale, but slavery itself, no. It was essentially a religious obligation entailed upon those here in New England, and they were bound by God's sanctions to take care of slaves, educate them, civilize them. He believed abolitionists were really dangerous and should be stopped. One historian has said that Dwight's mind was, quote, closed as tight as his study windows in January. Now, that didn't mean he didn't have an estimable mind. He did. He loved numbers. He was quite a statistician. And like so many of this era, he's full of contradictions. He thought the scientific revolution was by and large a great thing. What he could appreciate about the Enlightenment was essentially the growth of science, the growth of reason within science. What he wanted, though, was a trained clergy running the show, but let's train some scientists to figure out the physics of the world, to figure out the cosmology. Now, when it came to slavery in this first decade or two of the 19th century, again, Dwight is essentially trying to preserve Calvinism in some form. Maybe there's going to be some free will, although Dwight wasn't that fond of that. But he's trying to preserve an Edwardian vision of an elect and a vision of a God-ordained and God-directed civil society, polity, and moral world. He's going to train at least 2 generations, depending on how you count a college generation, at least 2 generations of ministers who will be spread all over New England and owe a lot to Dwight. It is kind of a crusade to save how Yale was founded and what it was founded for in a world that's really changing. And hence my advised employment of the term lost cause. He said this about slaveholders in 1815, the last year of his presidency. The Southern planter, said Dwight, who receives slaves from his parents by inheritance, certainly deserves no censure for holding them, especially the planter who, quote, treated his slaves with humanity and faithfully endeavors to Christianize them. He fulfills his duty so long as his present situation continues. Now, we can scoff at that, which you are, probably. This kind of idea has kind of poisoned the earth. People are born for this and they're born for that, and they're not to move out of their station. But we have to understand that too. We can condemn it and forget it, or we can understand it and remember it. I always choose the latter if I can. It was not a gradualist lament by Timothy Dwight. It was essentially an argument for the perpetuity of slavery. Now, what's going on outside the gates of Yale? Oh, Lord. This place, the country, the society is changing all around. The massive expansion of the American population in the wake of the American Revolution, and then, especially when the Western frontier, the British at least on the Western frontier, are in effect muted or eliminated after the War of 1812, the U.S. population grew more rapidly than any other nation in modern history in such a short period of time. Imagine if we had these rates of growth today. The U.S. between 1820 and 1860, let me start that over. There were more people who moved to the United States from abroad between 1820 and 1860 than lived here in 1790. 150,000 new immigrants arrived in the 1820s alone, which is the first big boom, big westward movement boom decade. 600,000 arrive in the 1830s, and that's still before the huge Irish and German migrations. 1.4 million people come in the 1840s, 2.8 million in the 1850s. Americans were reading already Stories of the Frontier, of course, irresistibly, James Fenimore Cooper. How many of you have read at least one James Fenimore? Does anybody read James Fenimore Cooper anymore? Yeah, not much up in the front row. How about Washington Irving? Oh man, Ichabod, Rip Van Winkle, etc. You don't know about Natty Bumppo, man, and Cooper. Outrageous dude. He was. Now, and Americans are, and they both became absolute bestsellers in England. It used to be said at the turn of the 19th century, who would ever read an American book? Turns out, everybody. Especially this frontier thing, this West, this movement of this society, this crazy diversity of this society, and this slavery question. The whole world was fascinated with that, still is. What's the world really interested in about America? Really, well, our economy, NBA stars, WNBA stars, but what is it about our history? Americans, very early, during Dwight's look, poor Timothy Dwight, how's he going to hold back? Americans started publishing best-selling sex guidebooks. Guides to contraception, guides to better forms of abortion, with titles like The Fruits of Philosophy, or For a Private Companion to Young Married People. The author of a lot of those books was a guy named Charles Knowlton. He was prosecuted twice in Massachusetts, ended up getting out. He was a physician. There were other physicians that kept writing these guides. And birth rates actually decreased by the 1820s. It didn't matter because the immigrant population was huge. So the population boomed and boomed and boomed. A women's literature takes hold in this country as nowhere else before it. And here's one for you, or two actually. A writer named John Neal and a writer named Catherine Sedgwick. Check this out. I mean, I like to give you a few things that you don't know, not just what's in our book. There was a guy he was born in Portland, Maine, 1793. His name was John Neal. He made himself a specialist in penmanship. He tried to teach people how to write. He tried this, he tried that, he tried law, he tried business. He wasn't doing very well, so he thought, I'm going to write something. I'll be a writer. I'm going to write popular stuff. He modeled Sir Walter Scott at first. He wasn't Sir Walter Scott. Then he published a book called, ready? Keep Cool, a novel written in hot weather. Under the pseudonym Somebody. Well, in that book we are told he is the first American to use in print the phrase, son of a bitch. I mean, you got to be famous for something. He loved, he said, to make his books about perplexity, incoherence, and contradiction. He seems to have succeeded. He also wrote a lot about interracial marriage, rape, incest, and open sexual desire, and how to do it. There's a reason he was popular. He went to England, did all right, came back. He arrived back in Portland. There were broadsides on the poles denouncing him. He got attacked in the streets. He was messing with morality. I have no evidence. I know nothing about how many copies of John Neal's books were secretly around in the dormitory rooms of Yale College. But some extremely important major American writers were really influenced by this guy, not least of which was Edgar Allan Poe. One of the most bizarre, some say most original and brilliant of all American 19th century writers. I mean, Poe, oh God. I mean, think about what Poe wrote about. Poe wrote about horror. He made that raven into a metaphor for wherever you want to take it. Well before Melville made Captain Ahab into a metaphor wherever you want to take it. He also apparently influenced Catherine Sedgwick, another New Englander. She was a young novelist who started out by, writing for women. Women characters her books were filled with the challenges of faith and marriage and property and the like. But she ended up writing some pretty edgy stuff. She did a collection called The New England Tale in 1822, telling of a heroine overcoming adversity through simple honesty and concern for other people. But then she went on. She eventually wrote a novel called Hope Leslie, published in 1827. It kind of echoed, she must have read the famous speech by Tecumseh. She ended up starting to write about Native Americans, like a lot of American writers did. There's a character in it, a Pequot woman who asks the Puritans who are around her, who have just beheaded a 16-year-old boy, quote, "You English tell us that the book of your law is better than that written in our hearts. For ye say it teaches mercy, compassion, forgiveness. If ye had such a law and believed it, would ye thus have treated a captive boy that way?" American writers, artists, those people of imagination are really experimenting now, way beyond anything Timothy Dwight could have tolerated. The world out there is really changing. Really changing. Demographically, economically, socially, politically. Now, let's Let's move to Yale now, even more so. Well, actually, let me briefly at least say a little more about this expansion, this wildly, this country wildly leaping toward a future. What future? Alexis de Tocqueville came here in 1831. You probably know that. He wrote a famous, huge 2-volume work called Democracy in America. It is still one of the classic texts, probably the greatest travel writing by a foreigner ever done about the United States. There are few things that might compare to it. But Tocqueville spent 9 months here. He's a French aristocrat. He was stunned by this place, appalled at times. He was appalled by the slavery question, though. He went into the South, but only for a matter of weeks. He went all over the country, interviewed all kinds of people. But there are many themes, many very important themes in Tocqueville of what he observed in 1831, and he writes up Democracy in America by 1835-36. But almost above all, it was just how Americans never sit still. They are always changing. They are not static. They're always creating these, what he called voluntary associations. They got clubs for this and associations for that and organizations for this and organizations for that. They really believe they're practicing democracy. They're sometimes terrible at it. Tocqueville said, quote, "In the United States, a man builds a house in which to spend his old age, and then he sells it before the roof is on." Move, 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 move. We still do. Restless these people were, said Tocqueville. Restless, always restless. He goes on. This is one of I have so many favorite passages in Tocqueville, but he said, change everywhere. Quote, "The American has no time to tie himself to anything. He grows accustomed only to change and ends by regarding it as the natural state of man. He feels the need of it more. He loves it for the instability, instead of meaning disaster to him, seems to give birth only to miracles all around him." Instability? God, give me instability. That's not your morning prayer, is it, usually? Tocqueville observed these Americans. They're just always moving somewhere else. They believe somewhere, over that hill, over that river, beyond that line, life's going to get better, or they'll make it better. Last Tocqueville line. Quote, "One sees neither dome, nor bell tower, nor great edifice, with the result that one has the constant impression of being in a suburb." In 1831, LA wasn't even a concept yet. Amazing, amazing. Well, change, movement, instability. Nothing could be more fundamentally at odds with Timothy Dwight's vision of Yale College and America. How can Calvinism survive? How can the Calvinist spirit, how can the standing order survive in this kind of world? I have to use another example, if you don't mind. And this time, I can't resist at least one use of Herman Melville. Melville comes a bit later. Moby Dick's not till the early 50s. But he's already writing many stories and tales and trying to have a life as a real writer, becoming one of our greatest writers, although in his lifetime he won't know that. He had a female friend, a very sophisticated literary female friend, just as Moby Dick was about to come out. A lot of you have read Moby Dick, or you're still reading it, or you've tried. And if you're like me, it sits by your bed, and now and then you just soak in a few chapters and wonder what they have to do with the last ones. He writes to this sophisticated female friend, and he says, book's just about to come out. Don't you buy it. Don't you read it when it does come out, because it is by no means the sort of book for you. This is pretty sexist, but maybe not for that time. It is not a piece of fine, feminine Spitalfield silk, but is the horrible texture of a fabric that should be woven of ships' cables and hawsers. A polar wind blows through it, and birds of prey hover over it. Oh, it's like, don't read it is, of course, an invitation to read it. There were a lot of Americans of imagination had so passed Timothy Dwight's vision, passed it by, ignored it, never needed it, hated it, and at any rate, I have many other examples here, but I'll spare you. Let's go to Yale now and talk about some of these, just in chapters 5 and 7 of our book. I lay out a lot of these people with fairly lengthy, well, not lengthy biographies, but treatments that tell us a lot about them. And the whole point of those sections is the sheer range of people who passed through here, who lived here, worked here, led Yale, and became its most famous faculty, among other things. Let's take Eli Whitney. Everybody's heard of Eli Whitney. Everybody still learns about the cotton gin. I love that little moment we found in Ezra, I guess it's in Ezra Stiles' diary. It's in the book, where Stiles says, one day this young man named Whitney walked into my office. He sat down and he told me about his little machine. The little machine. I'm going to go to let's see if I can get there that way. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Oh, I'm sorry to confront you with Calhoun so early. That was his little, well, that's actually even a little larger than his little machine. The first cotton gins were just little boxes, the whole purpose of which, of course, was to take the seeds out of the long stem cotton. But Whitney went to Georgia, well, first South Carolina, then to Georgia. He lived for quite a while on the Mulberry Grove plantation just west of Savannah. And that's where he learned how important, that's actually where he first invented his first gin. And that's where he learned how incredibly important it would be if there could be a mechanism, a mechanical way of de-seeding the cotton in ever-increasing ways. It had the potential to vastly increase production of cotton, and good Lord did it. He came back to New Haven, but the machine was out of the bag. He wasn't even the first person to really experiment with these things. He wasn't the first to utterly invent it. He was the first to make it really work. And then he went through lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit trying to keep a patent, but he failed at it. He couldn't control it. He lost control of it. He gave up on the cotton gin and moved, of course, on to guns and other products, especially the interchangeable parts of muskets and rifles. But cotton production absolutely skyrocketed. Make no mistake. No cotton gin, no cotton boom. It isn't all because of Eli, although around here you'd be hard-pressed to not believe that. In 1790, there were about 700,000 slaves in the United States. 10 years later, there are 908,000. By 1810, 20 years later, 908,000. By 1820, 1.2 million. By 1830, slightly over 2 million slaves. By 1840, 2.5 million. By 1850, 3.2 million. And by 1860, 4 million slaves in the United States. The only slave population in modern history and human history to naturally reproduce itself and not be fully reproduced by importation of new slaves. That 4 million slaves, roughly 4 million slaves in 1860, were, let's back up here, were worth approximately 3.5 billion, some still say 4 billion, 3.5 to $4 billion by 1860 as a financial asset. That rate as a financial asset, of course, grows in leaps and bounds through the 4 decades before 1860. That $3.5 billion worth of slave property by 1860 was more money in assets than all of America's railroads, all of its manufacturing put together. The largest single financial asset in the American economy by the 1850s will be enslaved people. It didn't all because of the cotton gin, but it didn't help make cotton king. The yield would double and then triple and then quadruple by decade. It meant that eventually the Industrial Revolution in textiles in Great Britain and eventually here in the American North was possible and became the great engine of international industrialization. Enter Benjamin Silliman. Oh, sorry, but this painting, by the way, is one of many. As cotton spread and slavery spread and the population spread, of course, slave auctions became extraordinarily common. They even became a kind of an American tourist objective. There were even tourist guidebooks that said, you know, you got to see Niagara Falls if you come to America. You should see New York City. You might want to see their capital in Washington, but it's got terrible sewers. But try to see a slave auction, because you can't see this anywhere else, except parts of Africa. This is by an unknown artist. It has many elements and features if you start looking closely. The inspection of people, the children, the mothers, the buyers, and the very light-skinned, fancy woman who's up for sale. More on well, now I'll leave up Calhoun for the moment. I didn't have a photo of Benjamin Silliman. That was dumb of me. Benjamin Silliman is the scientist that Timothy Dwight brought to Yale, the chemist, among other things. He came from Fairfield County. He was born in 1779, Yale grad. He came from one of the largest slaveholding families in Connecticut. And it was his mother that sold 2 slaves to send him to Yale, not Morris's. Sorry, Mike's back there correcting me in his mind. He actually wrote a very anti-slavery poem for his class commencement here at Yale. Silliman did. He was the first professor of chemistry and natural history. He is in many ways responsible for building science education in American colleges and universities, here first and then elsewhere. He was a founder of the Yale Medical School. He founded the leading journal, this American Journal of Science and the Arts, which still exists. He hated the slave trade, again, typical of so many of these Yale luminaries. Hated the slave trade, thought it was just the most despicable, outrageous thing. But he did not resist slavery itself. Silliman could go back and forth on whether he ought to condemn it, but in general, he did not. He very famously arranged to purchase for Yale, with a whole lot of money that Dwight gave him, namely $20,000. You know how much $20,000 was in the 18-teens? It turns out, I think it was about 1/3 of the entire budget of Yale. He purchased what was called the Gibbs Cabinet in England. This was this huge, giant cabinet of minerals. 12,000 mineral objects. It was like magic if you could have this thing. And you can still see parts of it over at the Peabody Museum. He was very close friends with John C. Calhoun. Calhoun, who goes through here in 1804. And many things to say about Silliman. When next time you're on Science Hill, go see his statue. It's still there. But in the 1820s and early 30s, he got a big grant out of the federal government, namely from Andrew Jackson, after Jackson became president. He befriended Andrew Jackson. Turns out Jackson befriended Silliman too. This is in the book. If you haven't read it, if you skipped over this, go back and read this. We found that Jackson had a foster son, I think it was, or stepson, foster son, who was going to Yale, but he got thrown out. Bad behavior, terrible behavior, whatever. Jackson gets in touch with the famous Benjamin Silliman and says, "Hey, professor, can you help me out here? Can you get my son, foster son, back in?" And in exchange for getting the boy back into Yale, Silliman got a giant grant that Jackson managed to provide out of the government. The grant was to do a full 2-year study of sugar production in Louisiana and learn everything about sugar cane and everything about the production of sugar as a major new international product and the slavery that made it possible. Please look at the epigraph of our book. It is a quote from Benjamin Silliman. Just open the front cover. It's a quote from Silliman to his aide, who was himself a chemist, a professor at Yale, saying, "Now go there, learn everything you can about slavery as a labor system, as a productive system, learn everything you can, but say nothing. Don't talk about it." Which is kind of a unwritten, unspoken, usually, mantra around Yale in the first half of the 19th century. Yeah, slavery is important in this country, but let's not talk about it. It's just too dangerous. Sometimes the way we get about certain international issues. No, let's not go there. Or elections. Oh, we can't talk about that. Got to be neutral. John C. Calhoun came here from South Carolina. He was among he was the beginning, and then among a wave of planters' sons who came to be educated at Yale. Between 1805 and 1818, the Dwight presidency, 10% of all Yale students were from the South, planters' sons. 25% were from outside of New England. This was becoming a national college and a national university. I said this earlier, Calhoun was probably the most distinguished graduate of Yale, at least by the middle of the 19th century. Calhoun learned part of his ideas, not all of it, but part of his ideas about a concurrent majority and this business of states' rights and how states should have the power to blunt powers of the federal government from none other than Timothy Dwight. Dwight was part of that effort which failed, that became ultimately the Hartford Convention, which was a kind of an effort at New England secession. It didn't work. It was kind of the death of the Federalist Party. It was the Federalists as a lost cause and a kind of a last hurrah. But Calhoun got some of these ideas here from, again, the great Dwight. Calhoun became one of the most important and famous or infamous supporters, defenders, moral defenders of slavery itself. He became so important in Southern life and thought and politics that abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, I say this in the book, began to refer to the South as Calhoundom. Well, Douglass loved doing that. He did it a lot of times. And, down in Calhoundom, the way they do things, it's like everybody knew that. Everybody knew the name. Everybody knew what that was supposed to mean. Calhoun's idea of the concurrent majority, this idea that all the states could be kind of of a surrounding phalanx to this federal government. The federal government ultimately couldn't do anything if even one of those states denied it. Hence, nullification, which will happen in 1829, 30, 31 in South Carolina. He forged some of those ideas here. I'm running out of time, and I will end with this. I'll return to some of these luminaries next Tuesday, when we surge on into the 1850s. Most of them make their fame in the 1850s. But let me end quickly with, you saw this on the screen the other day. That's Calhoun. That's the great triumvirate, of course, of Calhoun, Webster, and Clay. I just wanted you to see how handsome Calhoun was. Benjamin Silliman. Did I say I didn't bring him? I did bring him. Anyway, last point. You heard about this at least briefly from Mike last Tuesday. But at some point, folks, you got to go over to Grove Street Cemetery, because just inside the gate, 10 strides, is the gravesite of William Grimes. I'll end with this, maybe resume with it Tuesday. William Grimes escaped from slavery in Savannah, Georgia in the 18 teens. He had been born in Virginia. He was sold 5 times while he was enslaved. He stowed away on a ship called the Casket. Not kidding. To New York City, where he came ashore and he walked up here to this place called New Haven. He had a checkered, difficult, struggling life here. At one point he lived up in Litchfield, Connecticut. He probably went over to Boston for a while. He got himself arrested for this and that. But mostly he would live out his life all the way to the Civil War right over on Chapel Street. He sold fruit out of baskets, and he worked for the Yale boys. He worked for the students here at the college, doing anything they wanted him to do. In 1822, he wrote a narrative. He will write a second version of it later. It has, and by the way, this narrative, some of you have read Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs or some of the other great slave narratives. What makes this one unique, it is unique, is the first published narrative autobiography by an American-born slave. He self-published it here. It vanished from history. We knew almost nothing about it for decades and decades and decades and decades. It exists as an original edition in some libraries. It's now in a Norton edition. It has possibly the greatest ending in all the slave narratives. And another thing that makes it unique, is that he's writing this before there's any convention of slave narratives. He doesn't know there's some set of standards or something he's supposed to be writing to or for. Nobody supports him. And it's a deeply embittered book. You want to read a piece of angry imagination, read William Grimes. This is the way it ends. I hope some will buy my book from charity, but I am no beggar. I am now entirely destitute of property. Where and how I shall live, I don't know. Where and how I shall die, I don't know. But I hope I may be prepared. If it were not for the stripes on my back, which were made while I was a slave, I would in my will leave my skin as a legacy to the government, desiring that it might be taken off and made into parchment, and then bind the Constitution of glorious, happy, and free America. Let the skin of an American slave bind the charter of American liberty. Our man had a sense of irony in the midst of that bitterness. A lot going on in early 19th century America. Grimes is buried right in Grove Street Cemetery, right inside the front gate.